What do you call an economy where half the population pays rent first and survival comes second? In 2024, the answer was this. After paying rent, the average low-income renter in the United States had just $250 left for the entire month. Every other thing life throws at you is absorbed in $250. You already know by now that that is not a crisis that crept up quietly. In 2024, a record 22.7 million renter households in the United States alone spent more than 30% of their income on housing costs. That is the fourth consecutive record high. Half of all renters, cost-burdened. Not for 1 year, not because of a pandemic, consecutively, year after year after year. So the real question is no longer whether housing is unaffordable. Now, those are American numbers. In Nairobi, in Lagos, in Mumbai, in Jakarta, the percentage of income going to rent in informal housing markets is frequently higher, with none of the legal protections that exist even imperfectly in wealthier countries. The question we should be asking now is whether anything has ever actually fixed it, and if so, what exact mechanism was used. Before we get to answering that question, we need to spend some time on what doesn't, because the solutions that dominate this conversation, the ones that get debated on television and in legislatures, have a track record, and the track record is instructive. The first solution you will always hear is build more housing, increase supply, basic economics, more units means lower prices. The theory is not wrong, the timeline is. Between 2012 and 2019, the United States added millions of new housing units, and in the same period, rents rose faster than inflation in nearly every major American city. New construction reaches the top of the market first. Luxury apartments, high-end developments, properties that generate the highest return. It reaches low-income renters last. In many cases, new development in low-income neighborhoods accelerates displacement before it ever reduces rent. The peer-reviewed literature on this is substantial and consistent. Supply matters, but supply alone, aimed at the market, does not solve affordability at the bottom. The second solution you will hear is housing vouchers. These are government subsidies that help low-income tenants pay market-rate rent. The United States spends billions on this every year through the Section 8 program. Here's the documented problem. In unregulated markets, rental subsidies frequently get absorbed by landlords raising rents to capture the subsidy. Multiple studies have found that rents in neighborhoods with high voucher usage rise to meet the voucher ceiling. The government pays the gap. The landlord collects the gap. The tenant is back where they started, except now the entire mechanism depends on continued government funding. Neither of these solutions addresses the underlying power structure. In both cases, the tenant is a passive recipient. The landlord sets the price. The market or the government responds to the price the landlord chose. The tenant does not get to challenge the price. That is the design of the problem. Now, here's what the evidence says about the design of the solution. In every country where rent has come under meaningful, sustained, documented control, one thing changed before anything else changed. The burden of proof moved. Instead of the tenant having to prove the rent was unfair with legal knowledge they don't have, in a process designed for people with lawyers, the landlord had to prove the rent was justified. That single inversion is the mechanism. Everything else follows from it. Sweden has been running this system since the 1970s. It's called the bruksvärde, the use value system. Landlords cannot charge whatever the market will bear. The rent must be reasonable relative to comparable properties. If a tenant believes their rent is too high, they can challenge it at the Hyresnämnd, the rent tribunal. The tribunal assesses the property's utility value. If the rent exceeds what is reasonable, the landlord can be required to reduce it and repay excess charges going back to 2 years. The critical detail is this. The landlord cannot simply refuse the challenge and evict. Under Swedish law, if a landlord wants to raise rent and the tenant disputes it, the landlord must refer the matter to the tribunal. The tenant doesn't have to go anywhere. The burden is on the owner of the asset to justify the price of that asset, not on the person who needs a roof. The scale of this is worth pausing on. Sweden's largest tenant union currently negotiates rents for 3 million tenants across 1.5 million apartments. 4,000 elected tenant representatives participate in those negotiations. The system mirrors Sweden's collective wage bargaining model, the same architecture that produced stable wages applied directly to housing costs. The critics of the Swedish model are real and worth naming. New construction rents sit closer to market rates. Social housing waiting lists are long, sometimes decades long in Stockholm. The use value system has been reformed multiple times and remains contested. This episode does not pretend Sweden has solved the housing problem. Rather, Sweden has built a structural mechanism that has kept rent increases for existing tenants broadly in line with inflation, rather than racing ahead of it. That is a documented and meaningful difference from markets that have no such mechanism. Now here is what happened when a country tried to build something like it in an emergency, and what happened when the emergency ended. Scotland, September 2022. A cost of living crisis. Rents were rising faster than wages across the country. Then the Scottish government passed the Cost of Living Tenant Protection Act, a rent freeze set initially at 0%, then capped at 3% as of April 2023. Alongside the freeze, a moratorium on evictions. Landlords and property industry groups predicted the same thing they always predict: mass exits from the rental market, collapsing supply, a crisis worse than the one being addressed. The Scottish Landlord Register recorded what actually happened. Between August 2022 and November 2023, the number of registered rental properties in Scotland increased by 1.5%. Supply did not collapse. The landlord exodus did not materialize. The protection worked. Then it expired, March 31, 2024. The provisions ended, rents began rising again, and that is the lesson Scotland teaches. Not that rent tribunals don't work, but that temporary emergency measures applied to a structural problem produce temporary results. Scotland proved the principle. It did not build the infrastructure. The United States has something that looks like this mechanism. It is worth examining carefully because it illustrates exactly what the difference between a partial solution and a complete one looks like in practice. San Francisco's rent board has operated since 1979. For covered units, buildings constructed before June 1979, landlords can only raise rent by a small annual percentage set by the board. In 2025, that percentage was 1.4%. Tenants can file petitions to challenge unlawful increases. The process is accessible and free. This sounds like Sweden. It is not Sweden, and the reason why is found in one sentence. When a tenant moves out of a rent-controlled unit in San Francisco, the landlord can raise the rent to whatever the market will bear for the next tenant. A major 2019 study in the American Economic Review by Rebecca Diamond, Tim McQuaid, and Franklin Kwan from Stanford University examined what happened after San Francisco expanded rent control in 1994. The results showed two different stories happening at once. For tenants already living in rent-controlled homes, it helped. They were nearly 20% more likely to remain in their homes instead of being forced to move. That meant more stability and protection from sudden rent hikes. But many landlords changed their behavior. To avoid rent control rules, they removed units from the rental market by converting buildings into condos or owner-occupied housing. Overall, the city's rental supply fell by about 15%. With fewer rentals available, rents across the city rose by about 5.1%. So rent control helped the people who already had protected apartments, but for everyone else searching for housing, the city became more expensive. The protection had a hole in it, and landlords, rationally, legally, walked through the hole. This is not an argument against rent regulation. It is a precise description of what happens when rent regulation is incomplete. San Francisco protected tenants who stayed. Sweden protects the price of housing itself. The difference is not ideological, it is structural. Kenya has also had a rent tribunal since independence. The Rent Restriction Tribunal operates under the Rent Restriction Act, Cap 296. It serves tenants in major urban centers including Nairobi and Mombasa. It accepts M-Pesa receipts, photographs, and witness statements as evidence. No formal lease to file the case. The system has real limitations. The standard rent threshold, the ceiling below which the tribunal has jurisdiction, has not been meaningfully updated since 1981. In a country where rents have risen dramatically over 4 decades, this means the tribunal's jurisdiction covers an increasingly narrow slice of the rental market. The mechanism exists, but it has not kept pace with the market it was designed to regulate. What Kenya demonstrates is the principle applied at a different scale, with different resources, in a different context. The architecture is the same. A body exists whose function is to determine whether rent is fair, and a tenant can access it without a lawyer. What determines whether it works is not the existence of the body, but the ongoing political will to maintain it, fund it, and update it. So here is what the evidence across 4 countries, across 6 decades, across multiple continents actually shows. Rent tribunals work. The burden of proof inversion works. The mechanism is documented, replicable, and functions across radically different economies and legal systems. What determines whether it produces lasting results is whether it is built into permanent law or applied as a temporary patch, and whether it covers the full rental cycle, including the moment a tenant leaves, or contains a vacancy loophole that landlords can legally exploit. Sweden built it permanently and closed the loophole. Scotland proved it works and let it expire. San Francisco built it and left the loophole open. Kenya built the architecture and underfunded the maintenance. The solution exists. The question every country is actually answering, whether they say so or not, is who they have decided should bear the burden of proof, the tenant who needs a home or the landlord who owns one. Zara has been paying the same rent for 3 years. It went up 11% last year. She was given 28 days' notice. There was no explanation. There was no process. There was a number and a date, and the implicit understanding that if she did not accept it, she would need to find somewhere else. She did not know until this week that in her city a rent tribunal exists. It is underfunded. The process is slow. The jurisdiction has limits. But it exists. So she files a query, not a case, not a challenge, a question. Was this increase lawful? She does not know the answer. She does not know if she will get one. But last episode she filed a wage top-up application because not filing guaranteed nothing. The logic has not changed. Every city in the world has a rental market. Most of them have designed that market so that the person who needs a home bears the burden against the person who owns one. A small number have decided that if you own an asset and you want to charge more for it, you should be able to explain why. The evidence on what that decision produces is not ambiguous. Broke by design. The system does not explain itself. We do.